Welcome to Shadow Work Writers, Authors Interview Series. My guest today is fiction writer John Salter, author of Alberta Clipper, A Trout in the Sea of Cortez, and now There Will Never Be Another Time Like This. Here's what Brett Lott says. John Salter's stories are of people quietly in trouble. Here our lives come to crossroads, are parked at waysides, lives in need of a U-turn or a decision to drive straight on till daylight. These are ruminative tales of people on the brink of something they can't yet name, and Salter's beautiful language and willingness to let his characters careen make this a deeply moving and memorable collection. And having read the collection through twice by now, I can't help but agree. John, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
And so to start, I'd like to begin with a question inspired by my favorite story in the collection, Purple Haze.
Purple Sage.
Purple Sage, thank you. Purple Sage, not the famous tune. You're the main character's name is Blake, and you're writing at times delights in character self-loathing. And here's a line from Purple Sage. He's talking to himself, and he says, "You, sir, are a loser. You're a middle-aged living in Minnesota. You own 3 televisions. Conversations with your friends and neighbors are nothing more than bumper sticker dialogue. Upon your death, there will be an inch of particulars in the Fargo forum, which your wife will clip and paste into her scrapbook, along with a photo of you in front of the lake, holding a fishing rod, but no fish." That's great. I've had a similar monologues about myself, and so monologue like that is so funny, and it's a great window into Blake's interior life. Yet I feel like you write monologues like this without sneering at your characters. And
Yeah.
so tell me, how can fiction help us laugh at ourselves?
Well, I think it comes down to, we all have a public persona and a private persona. And I think with fiction, you really get to see someone's private persona. You get to see their actions in private, but also their thoughts usually. And I think it can kind of reassure us that we may not be so weird ourselves, because we can kind of see what other people are going through. I used to work at a lumber yard, and I worked with this guy. His name was Dave. I'll just call him Dave. He was very strong, big, strong guy, and he could carry a lot of lumber. That was important. And he was tough, and he was a little intimidating. And everyone was a little bit scared of this guy, Dave. But someone had a birthday, and we went to a bar, and we were hanging out, and Dave's wife had a few drinks and got a little loose. And she confided to me that Dave was deathly afraid of spiders. And that if he went to the bathroom and there was a spider on the wall, even a small one, he would kind of run out and she'd have to go in and deal with it. And that didn't make me respect him any less. It actually made me like him more, because there was a vulnerability that I was aware of. And it was sort of an honesty there. And I think fiction can do that. You can kind of see yourself in people and their vulnerabilities and weaknesses, and you can kind of be reassured by that.
Totally. Well, that was certainly my experience reading your collection. And if he's afraid of spiders and works in a lumberyard, oh man, that's going to be a scary place.
That could be why he was kind of tense all the
time. Totally. While we're on that topic of character, I'm just curious on your writing process. What comes first for you? Is it the idea, image, situation, or character? Stories in this collection, they have all 4.
For me, the process always varies. I will say that a lot of my writing seems to be created and developed in my unconscious mind. And many times, not all the time, but many times I'll sit down to write, and it'll sort of start to come out fully formed, like I'm just taking dictation from some other part of myself. Wow. And that's a really magical thing. It's mysterious to me, that process. I'm aware that not everybody has that happen when they're writing, so I value that. But other times it's more conventional. I start out with an idea, and I'm just sort of trudging sentence by sentence, and it's painful and it's hard, and I get to the end that way. But for me, when I think about my writing process, I think about the revision. That's the main thing for me. I would say if I spent 10 hours on a story, and I always spend longer than that, but if I can't do the math with odd numbers. So if I spend 10 hours on a story, 3 of that might be drafting and 7 of that would be revision. And I'm really, when I sit down to draft a story, I'm really nervous. I'm worried that I'm going to get 5 pages in and I'm going to run out of steam. I'm not sure where it's going. So when I finish a draft, I feel this kind of jubilation because I have something to work with. I say, okay, now I have a beginning and a middle and an end, and I can work on it. And that's when I go in with revision. And I'm not timid about it. I mean, I'll go in and slash and cut and move things around. And that's where I'll kind of develop things like the pacing of a story, and I'll put characters in and take them out. And, when I talk to younger writers, sometimes they don't like to spend much time on revision. They want to, when they finish a draft, they want to kind of do a once over and start sending it out for publication. They're kind of afraid to revise. And it makes me think of, my daughter is a firefighter and EMT. And we were talking about, CPR. And she said that it's unsuccessful a lot because people are too timid. And she said when she does CPR, she's trying to drive the top of that chest into the floor. And she said ribs are breaking, it's messy, it's aggressive, and it's disturbing for people to see, but that's what you have to do to save lives. And that's how I approach revision. I just get in there and slash and cut and move things around. And that's the part I enjoy the most. Drafting, I'm apprehensive, I'm nervous. But revision, then you have something to work with. You have control. You can take your time with it. And that's the main part of my process, is revision.
I resonate with that a lot. It's like when you have the draft done, you have something else between you and the blank page.
Yeah.
It's just so reassuring. Well, I definitely think the revision work you've done really paid off on these sterling stories. And you mentioned pacing, and I have a question about pacing now. You seem to trust in your reader, and your pacing kind of shows that. In New Science and in Purple Sage, you wait until we're deep into the story to fully uncover the protagonist's hidden heartbreak. Has it gotten easier to have patience of that kind with time and experience?
Yeah, I think so. I think time and experience, you develop kind of a muscle memory for how things should be. It's like I used to shoot pool a lot, play a lot of pool. And you reach a point where you're not really doing things consciously. Your body just knows the distances between the balls and the edge of the pool table. Your body just becomes learned in how hard to hit the cue ball.
Right.
You're not really thinking about it. So I think I've been writing for over 40 years. I mean, pretty much all the time. And I think you just sort of learn to be patient. I would say that's a good question, Shaun, because in some of my earlier work, like in my early 20s and in graduate school, you want to get into things right away. And I think that over time, I've sort of learned that you can take a more subtle approach and go in a little more slowly and provide what you need to provide, so that when you do start unveiling things, it's more meaningful, it's more successful.
Yeah, totally. I experienced that too in the reading of your work. It reminds me of something John Cheever said, how he always cautioned people of writing a scene like a man is checking in his bags at the airport and someone finds a head in the suitcase. Right on page 1. If you do that, it's going to be hard for a reader to swallow.
Yeah, and it's going to be hard to follow that up.
Right. What's left to say?
Yeah, that's great.
But yeah, I found Cheever early in your interview at Slant. You mentioned he was an influence that you found a little later, and I felt so happy that I discovered Cheever first. You know, when I was in like 17 or 18, I got to read some John Cheever in college, and so I definitely
Yeah,
see
one
some.
of my he's one of my favorites. And I did read. I mean, I read some Cheever in school and graduate school, um, but he really began to resonate with me later in my writing career, I
Mm,
guess you'd call it, because I really came to admire the subtlety and the nuance and and the use of metaphor. And so yeah, he definitely became an influence later.
mm. Yeah, and I noticed that Cheever has characters who are um that do some dramatic actions that are
Yes,
surprising, and at times they're done under the influence. And I noticed some of that in Purple Sage. Purple Sage's main character Blake. He makes several fateful decisions, not
yeah,
the least of which is purchasing a collectible handgun. And Blake's cringe-inducing decisions are surprising enough to be entertaining, yet in character enough to be plausible.
yeah,
And
yeah,
as Blake is a man, he's a man with the kind of new lease on life after an illness. He's medicating. And I'm just curious, how do you know when a story's action is just the right caliber? Do you discover it while writing, during the outlining, or at some other time?
well, thinking about the story Purple Sage, the question makes me remember I thought about a scene where Blake gets a hold of a horse and rides this horse into his uh, pig roast cookout party. And I thought that would be interesting if he rode in on this horse in his gunfighter apparel and everything. And then I thought, wait a second, where's Blake going to get a horse? And he doesn't know anything about horses. And I realized that would just really strain reality. And I thought it'd be kind of a fun thing. And then I thought he's going to ride in with his horse, and everyone's going to run over to look at the horse, and he's going to be the center of attention. And I've been trying to kind of paint him as someone who feels kind of invisible, who feels kind of
Mm,
inconsequential. And I thought, suddenly he's going to be this guy on a horse getting all the attention. So that's an example of how the action would be. It would be entertaining but implausible,
right.
and it wouldn't serve the story very well, and it would just sort of be a bit over the top. So I think you have to try things like that. I mean,
Mm, mhm.
I even wrote part of that scene. You have to try things sometimes to realize you don't need them.
Yeah.
um, I was thinking of this Fellini movie called Satyricon,
Mm,
and I read a book about the making of Satyricon. And at one point, there was a scene Fellini he thought he might want to use. So he went ahead and filmed it. He brought in all these actors and props and sets, and he filmed this scene just to prove to himself that he didn't want to use that scene.
wow.
And I do that sometimes in my writing. I'll write something in just to look at it and think, you know what, this is not plausible. This is not going to work. Yeah.
The nice thing, of course, is that we're writers, and trying something like that doesn't require millions of dollars of camera crew and all that.
Oh, exactly. I mean, exactly. I mean, you can do it on your kitchen table with a pen,
Right.
and then just cross it out.
Yeah.
That's one good thing.
Well, one thing in Purple Sage that does work perfectly is the use of the photographer Bravo's La Buena Femme Durmiendo. It fits perfectly in the story's themes. Great Blake groping for meaning, beauty, the elusiveness of youth, and an unrealized interest in the desert, which derives from the title. It's this photo that sets off that final spark to the story's powder keg, while offering up an unforgettable last line. How many endings of this story did you write?
Not This is a case where it kind of came together,
Hmm.
kind of organically the way I wanted it to. Um, Initially, I think there's a line in the story where he says, like the girl in the Bravo photograph he would either live or die, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't have that line in the ending, but I wanted to somehow reach back to that photo and have that be something he was thinking about while he might be dying or might be living. And so that's something I kind of added in revision, but the ending kind of came about very nicely and without a lot of stumbling. It just sort of came out, which happens once in a while. It's good.
Clicks into place. That's great. Um, are there we've talked a little bit about process. Are there process similarities you had with the stories in this collection in terms of inception, drafting, and final product, or does each one kind of have a separate story of how they came to be?
No, I would say that there's 6 stories in the collection. I would say that 4 of them were sort of written in sort of my standard way, as far as having an image or situation and just sort of going with it and seeing what happens. But 2 of the stories are pretty autobiographical. Habitats
Mm.
and the title story, There Will Never Be Another Night Like This. There's a lot of autobiographical elements in that, so that writing those 2 stories was a departure for me, because I don't normally write. There's a little bit of a writer in everything they write, but
Sure.
these had some situations and some people that were fairly true to life.
Mm.
So they were harder to write, because you can't just, people think, well, you just write what really happened and cut and paste and suddenly you have a story. Well, what you have is an English 101 essay, then, you know what I mean?
Right.
And a bad one. So, you have to take the essence and spirit of something that happened in reality and make it work as a story. And what I always go by is it has to work as a story. So
Right.
if a situation was based on my real life, but the way it really happened doesn't serve the story, I have to change that to make it serve the story. That's got to come first. I might be egotistical to say, well, I want to write this just as it happened in real life. Well, that's a memoir then. I mean, I'm not writing a memoir. I'm writing fiction. So the story comes first. It has to come as a story. But I spent a lot of time on those 2 stories trying to find a balance between what actually happened in real life and people that are actual people that I knew, and finding a balance between that and good fiction and a good story. So the process for those 2 stories was a lot different than I'm used to, and it was harder because I'm looking back at things that really happened and trying to turn them into fiction. So it was hard. It was harder than a lot of stories I've written. Yeah.
Fascinating. Well, the payoff is definitely worth the work. While we're on habitats, there's so much we could talk about, but a lot of it you've mentioned in prior interviews. But the one, your side characters depictions are compelling. It's like a good Coen Brothers movie, where even the side characters are played by a memorable character actor. There's a priest in Habitats, and
Yeah.
he's detached and observant in a way that could be pervy or merely worldly wise. And intriguingly, you don't decide this for the reader. And that comes back to your trust in the reader. How do you ensure a reader freedom of interpretation in your work? Is it
Well,
editing back? Go ahead.
let me read that paragraph,
I'd love that.
if that's okay.
Yes, please.
And in the story, this young man who's 12 or 13, he witnesses a tragedy with his friends, and he goes home, and his father works for the Diocese of Rochester, New York, which my father actually did. And his parents are having people over, and this priest is there. So the young man, he kind of wants to talk about what had this tragedy, but he doesn't want to go too far.
Right.
So he says to the priest, "What do you do?" Nils said. His mouth went dry again. He sipped his water. "What do you do if you were there when something terrible happened and it wasn't your fault and you really couldn't do anything to stop it, but you feel like maybe there was more that you should have done, and you didn't tell anyone about it either, when maybe you should have, because that could bring real problems. He immediately felt like he sounded insane or stupid, like his classmates when they read run-on sentences aloud, an entire essay with no punctuation, the stuff that made their teacher, Mr. Price, press his palms against his face. The priest pushed a chunk of lime into the rim of his glass. I would say live with the guilt, not in the guilt.
Mm.
Nils nodded. Father Mulvaney was looking out the window as if reflecting on the question, as if he were going to offer a little more guidance. If he had asked, Nils was ready to tell him the truth, the whole story right there in the kitchen.
Mm.
He kind of wanted to, but then Father Mulvaney said, how old is your sister now? Marie, is it? Yes, Marie, she's 16. Ah, he said. Well, she's filling out very nicely. So there's a creepy factor there.
Yeah.
And I try to kind of leave it at that, because that scene is very near the ending, when Nils is sort of reflecting on his family's move from Iowa and thinking maybe they should have stayed in Iowa.
Mm.
The things are too weird living in upstate New York in an industrial city. And if I had made his creepiness more overt, I felt like that would kind of overwhelm the ending, which is really about Nils's thoughts about, should people stay in their own habitat, or should they leave their habitat? But you're right. I mean, it could be, this priest could just be just a nice guy. Like, well, she's filling out nicely, but there's an underlying kind of subtext to creepiness there, and that is part of what Nils is thinking about later in the story, when he's thinking maybe this was a mistake moving here. But you're right. You have to kind of trust the reader. I feel like you have to trust the reader to draw those conclusions. I know when I'm reading fiction, I like to have questions that aren't always answered by the author, or by the story. I like to have something to think about. And you can kind of go where you want with this priest and his observation. It's definitely creepy, though.
Yeah.
Definitely creepy.
Well, since we're dovetailing on that scene, the priest is drinking and many of the characters imbibe and smoke. Tell me about the usefulness of having characters who drink and smoke.
Well, there's two things going on with that, Shaun, I think. And one of them is, sometimes cigarettes and booze are kind of a literary device. They can kind of reveal someone's state of mind. And you got to remember, I grew up in the 70s and the 80s, and people smoked on airplanes, they smoked in doctors' offices, wherever you went. So that if you have a character, for example, who smokes a cigarette to the end and then lights a new one with the butt of that cigarette, they're chain smoking, that says, okay, this person is stressed out, they're feeling a lot of anxiety, that's why they're chain smoking. Or the character who lights a cigarette and takes a couple puffs and then puts it out, well, that person is distracted, and they're kind of they're not concentrating. So or someone who goes to the bar and orders a drink, slams it down, and orders another one. Okay, that reveals something about their state of mind. The problem is, I was thinking about this, the usefulness, for example, of cigarettes as literary device, it's kind of at an end, because people don't smoke much anymore, and readers may not relate to those kinds of literary devices. And I'm thinking about a few years ago, I was in Nebraska, in Lincoln, Nebraska, and I was smoking a cigarette outside of a Starbucks. And this little kid came up to me and he pointed to it. And he said, "What's that?" He'd never seen anyone smoking a cigarette. And I said, "Well, kid, that's something that some grown-ups do." And then his mom kind of jerked him away. But I thought, in a few years, if he reads a story and someone's chain smoking, he'll have no idea what that means. So we have to kind of have devices that fit with our current culture. It made me think of something my brother told me a few years ago, that he was in his kitchen scrolling Facebook on his laptop. And while he was looking at his laptop and Facebook, he picked up his phone and he started scrolling Facebook on his phone because he was just totally not paying. He was just bored. He was
Yep.
bored and
Yep.
killing time. And I think we've all done stuff like that. That would be a better literary device now than probably a cigarette, for people that are, younger than 30, 35, or 40. So part of it is it's a device. But when you look at my characters, yeah, a lot of them smoke and drink and take drugs and marijuana and codeine. And I really think it's because the people I grew up with, people within my own family,
Mhm.
sometimes my friends, people I
Mhm.
worked with, especially in the Northern Plains, in North Dakota, Minnesota, uh, a lot of people up here have a hard time talking about their troubles.
Mhm.
And they're kind of stuck in what my daughter-in-law, the men especially, my daughter-in-law calls the man box, where they
Mhm.
have trouble talking about these things. If you look at the story of New Science,
Mhm.
Barker, the main character, his wife is on the internet looking at traumatic brain injury message boards, and she's processing and talking to people about these
Right.
things. And he's not doing that. He's drinking gin and tonics. He's smoking. He's
Mhm.
fooling around with this woman. So it's unhealthy coping strategies,
Right.
but it's very common to the people I kind of grew up with and the people I know.
Mhm.
And I was telling somebody that, I mean, most of my stories could end after 3 pages if the last scene was them walking into a psychotherapist's office, and to deal with their problems that way. I could just sort of end each story after 3 pages. I could have a rubber stamp ending like that. So it really has to do with the people I grew up with and the time that I grew up, and especially around here. I kind of came of age in North Dakota. It's where I went to
Mm.
college, where I've lived most of my life, and there is sort of I said somewhere that there's a kind of, this area breeds a kind of stoicism
Mhm.
and a mentality that you don't talk about your problems to other people and you don't go for help for your problems, but it's perfectly fine to hit the substances to try to help your problems. So I think that's what a lot of my characters are doing. It's really just the people I know.
No doubt. Well, thank you for that answer. And while we're on the topic of kind of stoicism and closeness, and I found it interesting that all the 6 stories are told through third person limited
Yeah.
POV, and that, Jonathan Franzen, another Midwest writer, not the same area, but he mentions how just a good rule of thumb is to stick with third person limited unless that first person POV is irresistible. Talk to me about the usefulness of third person limited over first person, especially for the stories in this collection.
Well, I mean, I would tend to agree with Franson on that.
Hmm.
And almost all my writing, my stories and fiction is third person limited. Um, I would be very nervous to take a more omniscient
Yeah.
point of view. But see, I'm a guy that if I go to a restaurant and there's too many options on the menu, I get a lot of anxiety.
Hmm.
I want there to be 3 options to choose from. So with omniscient stuff, they often call that head hopping, where you're hopping from one head
Hmm.
to another. And I would much rather work with one character and have that point of view and have them learn and have us as readers and have them learn about other people through their dialogue, through their actions, through their behavior. I'm much
Hmm.
more comfortable with that. I've written a few stories. I think in my first collection, a couple of the stories were first person point of view, and I don't mind that, but I just kind of gravitate towards the third person limited point of view. Um, to me, and this sounds trite, like a trite writer thing to say, but the story decides how you're going to
Mm,
tell it.
no doubt.
And for me, most of the time, the third person is the way I go. I think the first person, when I've done that, it can be really fun because it's kind of like method acting. It's
Mm.
like you're becoming that character, you're becoming that person, um, and I think that can be enjoyable. but uh, I haven't done it a lot. I'll probably do it more. In the last few years, I've written a bunch of flash fiction that
Yeah.
I've had out there, and often that's first person stuff
Hmm.
in a way. So yeah, I don't want, I like freedom as a writer, but
Mhm.
I don't mind some guardrails.
Hmm.
Uh, so I don't mind adhering to some rules with point of view and things and first or third person point of view. I'm comfortable with that. I like, you can have too much freedom sometimes.
No doubt. Yeah. I mean, the constraints gives you something to grow your creativity in.
Yeah.
A lot of writers express. Well, speaking of creativity, I noticed, switching gears a little bit too, I noticed that the titles of your stories are enigmatic. There's the new science, said with some irony, I feel. In the long run, which is Champion's kind of misplaced confidence in himself and his kind of myriad of harebrained plans. And then Mar Vista is a street that doesn't face the ocean.
Yeah.
Purple Sage, is about a plant that the character's never seen. And I like that these titles, for me, they felt like they were sly and they related to the core themes diagonally. Even the titular story is this kind of anthem of the young and dumb, and then yeah, it ends up turning into this story that achieves a kind of epic uniqueness. How do you decide on a story's title?
Well, early on, I had a professor at University of North Dakota named John Little.
Mm.
John Little was a real character. Like he drove a convertible all year round with a top down, even in 30 below weather. And he was from Mississippi, and he's the only person I ever knew whose accent got stronger every year he was away from home. And it got to the point where you couldn't understand him at all. But he had this. He taught fiction writing, and he always said, "Bad title, bad story."
Mm. Hmm.
And I took that to heart.
Yeah.
And I mean, I haven't seen a lot of evidence that that's true. But I've always been very particular about titles, and I want titles to sort of be unique and fresh.
Mm.
And but I don't usually title a story until I'm finished with it, because
Hmm.
when I write a story, I'll think that the story is about X.
Mm.
And as I revise it and work on it, I'll realize, yes, it's about X, but it's also about Y and Z.
Mm.
And I don't usually know what a story is really about until I'm finished with it and I've done a lot of revision. So that's the point when I'll try to look for a title that will kind of relate to what the story is really about.
Mm.
It'd be very rare for me to have a title right away on the page and then underneath it write a story. I usually have to kind of be confident I know what it's about and then try to find a title that works. And I also, I used to kind of fancy myself as being good at titles. I know in graduate school, other writers would sometimes want me to give them a title
Hmm.
for their story, and I felt kind of like a big shot. Like blessing them with, like a pope blessing them with a title. You know, there it is, 13 buns. That's the title. And so that's what I do. And I don't like changing titles. And I had to change one of the titles in this story.
Ooh.
Um, the title story, There Will Never Be Another Night Like This.
Mm.
Originally, the title was Night on Earth,
Mm.
because there was this crazy night for this kid.
Right.
It's a night on Earth. And then Greg from Slant Books, he said, that's the name of a Jim Jarmusch movie, Night on Earth. And I said, oh, God damn it. And then I remembered, yeah, that was a Jim Jarmusch movie called Night on Earth. And I could have used it. You can't really copyright a title, but I thought I don't want to use Jim Jarmusch's
Hmm.
title, my story. So we had to kind of cast around, and Greg actually kind of helped me. I'd throw some ideas at him, he throw some ideas at me, and we kind of came up with a title. It kind of relates to a line in the story where the young man wonders if there will never be another night on Earth like this night,
Hmm.
uh, and so that's kind of where it came from. but normally I don't like changing titles. Um, I feel like it's like it's a jinx or bad luck. I'm very superstitious about things. So yeah, but I mean, usually a title pops into my head after I kind of finish the story and I know what it's about,
Hmm.
and I'm able to kind of come up with that.
That's great. And so while you were mentioning that the process of publishing through Slant, from your other interviews, it sounds like it was a really positive experience, and
Yeah.
so happy you had that. Though not surprised, Greg Wolf, he was a professor at SPU while I was going there, and his wife Susan was one of my professors, and
Okay, good.
they're great folks. And so I'm just while we're on the topic of publishing, curious if any of these other stories were previously published.
Well, the story of New Science was published, but it was in a different kind of a different form.
Mm,
Um, years ago in a journal called Meridian.
mm,
Everything else is fresh to the book.
mm,
And the pattern used to be that as you wrote short stories, they would get published in the literary journals. That's how it worked for my first book.
mm.
And then once you've had a bunch of those, then you put them together as a collection. And it's helpful to the publisher because they can say, well, this was published in Chattahoochee Review, and this story was
Right,
published, North Dakota Quarterly. So they've kind of been vetted already in a way.
right.
And so that's kind of the pattern. One of the things I ran up against with the stories in this collection, several of them are very long stories.
Mm,
The title story in Purple Sage, I think, is 10,000 words. And there's only a handful of literary journals in America that want to take long stories like that
mhm.
because it makes sense. So, why take a 10,000 words? If you have a journal that's 140 pages or something, why take a 10,000 word story that's pretty good by one guy when you can take two 5,000 word stories that are pretty good by two different guys or women, whatever.
Right,
And,
right.
and and so the length kind of was kind of an issue, but ultimately, my dog just came in. Ultimately, I thought they worked together as a collection.
Mhm.
They're pretty cohesive thematically. I thought they kind of worked together, and part of it is I just didn't want. It takes so long. You submit a story to a journal and you wait a long time, and then they may accept it or reject it, and then it's going to be another year before it comes out. I thought, well, I'm not getting any younger, so
Yeah.
I'm just gonna, I'm gonna send this collection out before most of the stories have been published and see what happens. And it worked out.
I love hearing that. I just got an acceptance today for a short story. It might not get published till spring 2026.
Yeah, yeah.
It's like, whoa.
I mean, yeah, but you can your anticipation train is going to be a long train. That's good.
Yeah. But no, I liked hearing that because the effort of publishing stories piecemeal, it's such a crapshoot. You can do what the journals tell you and read their journal and read a couple of their journals and then send them a story you think would be perfect. And then you get a form rejection letter back. So, well, you probably wouldn't get a form rejection,
Well,
but
I mean, no, I mean,
I
I get
do.
I get plenty of rejections, and I just had a
Mm,
story accepted that I've been submitting for 4 years and submitted to 19 different journals.
hmm.
And
Yeah.
you just got to be persistent, and then finally you hit the right editor on the right day, and they like your stuff, and then you're good to go. But it's a tough endeavor, and if people are impatient, it's not something they should be doing because you
Yeah.
just got to be patient and you got to have a thick skin. And just because this person didn't like it at this journal, someone else may love it.
Right. Yeah. Well, to shift gears just a little bit, in terms of style, your stories are very easy to read, but yet they're demanding, and that they invite deliberation, for deeper interpretations, and they avoid easy answers too. I really appreciated that about the work. How'd you develop this? You know, sort of the sentences have this kind of sprezzatura to them. They, you know, they come out very naturally. But then at the end, it's like, whoa, what happened? I got to think about that.
That's what I hope happens with people. Um, my ex-wife used to read some of my stories, and it was always disheartening because she'd get to the last page and then she'd turn it expecting more.
Like that's it. That's all I
Yeah,
got.
that's it. That's the ending. Um, sorry you didn't connect with you. And you know, I prefer, as a reader, I prefer fiction that's pretty accessible.
Mm-hmm.
I don't like work that makes you run through an obstacle course
Mm.
to try to get somewhere. Sometimes I feel like people are trying to prove they're smarter than everyone else
Mm-hmm.
by making things more difficult than they are. And there's some people that really like that kind of stuff, and that's fine. So when I write, you know, I want someone to read it and understand it. And there are questions that are raised, but those questions, not everyone is going to pick up on those questions.
Right.
So you can read it on one level and get a lot out of it and get some meaning out of it, I hope. But another kind of reader might see some nuance and subtlety and some questions that they have to kind of work with. You know, I guess I like some ambiguity.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I've had a lot of people talk to me about the endings of my stories. And they seem, you know, they seem to like them, but they seem to comment that it requires them to sit back and do some thinking.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And people in my own family have said that. And it's just the only way I know how to do it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not O. Henry, you know, where write the gift of the Magi or whatever, and everything is sewn up at the end.
And he just outright tells you,
yeah,
you know,
yeah, just hammers it into you.
yep.
This is the ending. You know, I guess, you know, I've been in enough situations in life that there is ambiguity in real life, and
Mm-hmm.
I think I try to reflect that in my writing. Um, and it's not that someone could say, well, Salter's afraid to commit to an ending, and I don't, and it's not that. It's just that things aren't always sewn up very neatly for people.
Yeah,
And the kind of people I write about.
no doubt. While we're talking about people, there's a comically unlikable wife character in Purple Sage, Ray. And you know, I think that if a reader is charitable, we can chalk some of her unlikability up to her edginess before a big event. That's kind of what I started thinking about after the story. Tell me how you threaded the needle of hilarity with her while not descending into stereotypes. And were you worried readers would be turned off by her depiction?
Well, Ray was tricky for me to write because if she was too warm and loving, then the character Blake could have
What's this
gone to
guy's
her
problem?
and said, I'm troubled, I'm unhappy, I'm worried about where I am in life. She would have embraced him and then the story would be over. You know, but at the same time, I didn't want to make her too cold and hard because then a reader might say, why are you staying with this woman? You know, this witch. Why are you staying in this marriage? So I had to kind of strike a balance. And I don't know if I see her as completely unlikable. I see her. I've had people tell me in this area, North Dakota and Minnesota, okay, that they recognize her as being someone from around here. There's a sort of no nonsense woman, practical. She's a very practical person.
Yes.
She doesn't suffer fools gladly. And I needed to have her kind of be like that and also be preoccupied with this event. It's a huge deal to her.
Right.
And Blake is just sort of going along with her instructions. And so I kind of wanted her to be preoccupied and kind of distant,
Mhm.
but not not too harsh and not too soft.
Right.
And so I did a lot of work in revision and trying to craft her into that kind of person. Um, yeah, people in North Dakota and Minnesota recognize Ray. They
Huh.
know a Ray,
Mhm.
and so she's sort of the typical Midwestern
Mm.
no nonsense woman. But yeah, I mean, I don't know how people really think of her. I just know that I've had people say they they think she's modeled after Judy, and I'm like, no, she's not modeled after Judy, and that kind of thing. So it's recognizable to people around here. I don't
Hmm.
know if someone in Manhattan would recognize how she does things, or someone in LA, but around here she's kind of recognizable.
Hmm. Yeah, she's great. She's really made for some really funny reading. To get granular here, talking about language and playing with language. Uh in the New Science, there's this line. He gets out of bed, pulls on his pants, his shirt, plugs his bare feet into his shoes. Using plugs I thought was brilliant because it's off kilter a bit. It's not like the as obvious as he slides or he puts. And I think it communicates that unthinking compulsion of going to drink more in the face of grief. When does inspiration come for using an off kilter verb like that?
Oh, that's a good question. Um, Trying to remember when I wrote that. I
Mm,
think when I wrote it, I probably did have a more conventional
mm,
verb. I think you put on his shoes. Um, but I think I wanted something different. And sometimes you're probably aware of this in your own writing, but sometimes the universe just tosses you a word and says, "There you go," and plugs
mm,
seem to fit. And then when I reread it and looked at it, I thought that is kind of perfect.
mm,
It kind of, to me, it kind of captured almost the sort of dis,
mhm.
the dispassionate way he was doing it. He just sort of, I'm going back down to drink, and that it was sort of mechanical. Yeah.
Mhm.
But the universe, I mean, that was a case where it just popped into my head, Shaun.
Mm.
That was it.
That's great. I could use some more of those. um Great. Let's see where we're at. We're almost towards the end, and so I just have two questions left here. Oh, sorry. Before I move on from that, that's right. The ending of that story with that verb there reminded me of the end of The School by John Bartolome, where he says that the new gerbil walked in and all the kids cheered. It's like, what the fuck? Like the gerbil didn't walk in; it crawled in. Why? And so we all debated about that in undergrad, but I really like how that it's like this after they're talking about death and everything, and then this like new animal like strolls on in. I don't know. It just was perfect. So
I like that, and I think that, I mean, he was probably fully aware of what he was doing,
yeah.
and yeah, that's good.
Um, let's see. With this last one, getting a little on the personal end, when you type up John Salter and Twitter or the internet, John Hunter Gray comes up or John T. Salter Jr. Is that your father?
That is my dad, and
Wow.
he was a civil rights hero.
Yeah.
He died in 2019.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's him.
I mean, yeah, that photo. I mean, I've seen that photo and how many textbooks, growing up, and just curious, like, was it ever challenging, setting out as a fiction writer? Did you ever have that, kind of where's my great cause type of thing, or
Yes, yeah.
I mean, I
Uh,
asked myself that, and I don't have, a lionized civil rights leader as a father, so.
I can tell you that everyone in our family, and I'm talking about my siblings and
Mm,
me, my cousins
mhm,
who know their Uncle John, his grandchildren, my son, other grandchildren, they reach a point in the early to mid 20s where they compare what we're doing to what my dad did
Mhm.
when he was that age, because he and my mother were in Mississippi when he was like 26 and 27 years old.
Mm.
And he was beaten in the street by police, and he was the Ku Klux Klan shot at their house at Tougaloo College, and the bullet just missed my sister's crib.
Mm.
So all of us hit that point where we think, are we doing enough?
Yeah.
Or, should we be civil rights people, community organizers? Should we be union organizers?
Mhm.
And everyone in the family has hit that point and kind of compared ourselves to that. But I can tell you the one thing about my parents is they never, and my mother was a big part of it, so she was in there. They never said, you need to find a cause, you need to self-sacrifice. Their main thing was that if you're lucky enough to have some kind of calling,
Mm.
that you answer that calling. So, my brother became a journalist, and I have a sister who was a social worker, and I went into fiction writing, and people did things like that, teaching, a lot of teaching in the family. My daughter's a firefighter, my son teaches, my daughter-in-law teaches. So it was sort of like, you don't have to shed your blood
Mm.
on the streets to do good things. So
Mhm.
they were just more interested. Now, if I had said my calling is to sell mutual funds,
Yeah.
they might have been like, they might have counseled me about that,
Yeah.
talked to me about that. So I mean, their main thing was just that you find a passion and follow it. And the reason they thought that way was because our core value growing up was to defend people who need to be defended,
Mhm.
to look out for people with fewer resources, people that were oppressed, so that as long as you were doing that as a human being, it didn't really matter what your career path was or what your job was, as
Mhm.
long as you stuck to those values. So yeah, they were. My dad never looked at me and said, what you're writing isn't really helping anybody.
Mm. Yeah.
He never said that. It was more
That's
like,
good.
okay,
Yeah.
you're an artist,
Mm.
follow your art, try to
Mm.
evolve in your art, and that's what matters.
Mm. That's great. And so
Because
I just
his father was a, I'm sorry to interrupt.
no, no.
My dad's father was a painter, uh,
Hmm.
fairly well known in Arizona. He was a painter. My
Huh.
dad's brother was an artist. So it
Hmm.
kind of came from both an arts and activist background. So they were very comfortable with my decision to write. Yeah.
That's great. I'm glad that they encouraged you that way. I feel like this is kind of a fun question to end on. In your interview with Slant, you echo your character Blake in Purple Sage by saying that you haven't ever had a hobby outside reading and writing. And I relate to this. Why is literary fiction the hobby to end all hobbies?
Oh boy. Well, I mean, I think on one level, you'll never get bored. I mean,
Mhm.
because there's always a new thing to write about. You're always trying to become a better writer. There's always something new to work with. There's millions of situations and characters to work with. So on the one hand, you never get bored. But I would say for me, and I've been doing this a long time, too long maybe. And also, it is something you can do as long as your mind holds out. I mean,
Mhm.
my favorite living writer is Thomas McGuane,
Mhm.
and he's in his 80s and still writing. I mean, as long as your mind holds out, you can keep
Mhm.
going. You can't play golf forever because your body wears out. But I was thinking about how whenever I sit down to write, I feel like I'm on a first date.
Mhm.
I feel
Mhm.
nervous, I feel excited, and I feel hopeful. And that doesn't change. I mean, I sat down to start a new story the other day, and I went through all those emotions. And I'm thinking, what other endeavor is there where every
Mhm.
time you do it, you have that kind of excited, queasy feeling? There's nothing else like that.
Mhm. That's a great answer, and I love that metaphor of the first date. Well, anyone who's viewing out there, make sure you get yourself a date with There Will Never Be Another Night Like This. And with me has been John Salter. John, thank you so much for your wisdom and taking some time to talk with me today.
Thank you for having me. It's been great.